Okay, welcome. And this is the quiet, uneventful session, because we're just talking about politics and Brexit. Nothing to see here. Move along. In case I have missed something, I'm Gary Gibbon, Channel 4 News. I'm a journalist, so I probably do miss a lot of things. We have three fantastic guests with us to address you about where things are going with politics and Brexit. You've seen them all on the list. I won't do massive introductions, but we're going to start with Professor Rob Ford, who actually has some slides for you. He clearly hasn't been reading the work to rule instructions from his union. Tim has no slides, and I'd like you to welcome Rob.
Thanks, Gary. Yes, sorry about this. As an academic working on public opinion, I feel basically naked without PowerPoint and slides, so I'm going to inflict them on you. They are, however, short and to the point, I hope. So, the first thing I wanted to bring up is basically there's four questions I think it's worth thinking about when looking at the politics of Brexit going forward. And I'm trying to talk about it not just in terms of where we go a year from now, but also further along than that. And the first question is to consider what impact Brexit has had on political alignments so far and whether or not that impact is actually going to last in the long run. Second question is, how is demographic change going to change the electoral coalitions for and against Brexit, and indeed alignments that are not just to do with Brexit but also to do with new things we're seeing coming into our politics, such as generational conflict, social values and so on. The third is, how is the Brexit process itself changing voters' political views, both on issues directly to do with the EU and also to do with issues that were packaged up with the EU question in the Brexit referendum. In particular, I'm thinking of the issue of immigration, which was a big issue in the EU referendum, but where we still haven't resolved the question of what our immigration system is going to look like after we leave the EU. And the final question I'm going to think about just a little bit is, how will voters' views on Europe change once we have this conference a year from now and Brexit is not a prospect but becomes a reality? Now, on the first question, my first pretty graph is basically to say to you the 2017 election surprise was in many respects a surprise that you could have predicted by looking at people's behaviour in the EU referendum. Essentially, the Conservatives did better wherever the vote for leave was higher. These categories are vote for leave in the EU referendum from under 35% to over 65%. And the purple bar there that's going very sharply downwards, that is UKIP. So the Conservatives mined UKIP votes successfully in order to achieve an increase in their vote share where places voted to leave. The surprise on the other side, though, was that Labour did very well in areas that voted to remain, and as a result, everywhere outside of the areas with the very highest EU Brexit vote actually swung towards Labour. So they won over a lot of Remain voting voters. And in the post-2017 election discussion, I've noticed that there is a lot of focus on Labour leavers, and Labour leavers are indeed an important group of voters. There's rather less focus, and I say this as a person who grew up in a suburban part of Surrey, on the kind of middle-class suburban Conservative Remainers who have a lot of reasons to be not particularly happy with the direction in which their Conservative government are going, but which don't seem to feature quite so much in the vox pops about how the Brexit process is going that I've seen, at least on the media to date. The second question I wanted to ask is, well, what about the demographic story? And my chapter in the report, which I hope you will all read, gets into this at some length. We have to remember that the Brexit point is one point along a very long journey. And the very long journey is from a country that was very white, where very few people went to university, and where people had, in general, quite socially conservative values. The destination is a place that is more diverse, a place that has far more graduates and far more ethnic minorities and far more people who have parents who were migrants, and a place where young people have much more socially liberal values. That journey is continuing as we move through the Brexit transition period and as we move into a post-Brexit reality. reality. So the truth is that governments facing the electorate in 2022 or 2027 will be facing a much more diverse and socially liberal electorate than the government who faced the electorate in 2017 or in 2010 or in the EU referendum in 2016. That process is generationally structured. John Curtis may have mentioned earlier that age is now the biggest predictor of voting choice for the first time in our history. And in my view, that is partly rooted in the fact that if you grow up, if you're 18 or 19 in Britain today, you are growing up in a diverse society. You are much more likely to go to university and you are much more likely to hold socially liberal values. Those demographic changes I'm talking about, they occur in the aggregate, but they are much more dramatic when you look between generations. That's that graph. Final couple of graphs. The immigration question. This is close to my heart. I've done a lot of research on immigration. It was also clearly close to the hearts of a lot of the people who voted in the EU referendum. The big surprise, in my view, post the referendum is that we have seen a large and sustained shift towards more positive views about immigration. The share of voters who say immigration is one of the most important problems facing the country, as this graph shows, has roughly halved in the year and a half or so since the vote to leave. The share of people saying that immigrants make a positive economic, black line, or cultural contribution, grey line, to Britain has bumped up by about 10 to 15 percentage points, which is actually quite a large shift given that in the previous 15 years prior to that, you saw a smaller shift than that. So we have seen a move on these very contentious issues of immigration and identity, but it is not the move that I think a lot of people talk about, which is the idea that Britain has become more inward-looking, more divisive, possibly more hostile to outsiders. Actually, the opposite has happened. We have a Britain that is more accepting of both the cultural and economic arguments for immigration being good than it was before the referendum happened. Okay, so where does that leave us when we actually leave? Well, I think that there's three things we may see. And here I fear I'm going to add to the abuse of the English language that Brexit has already produced. There's been much discussion of regret, but I suspect, as John Curtis will have, if you were seeing his talk earlier, he will have, as he often does, pointed out that there's not really a great deal of evidence for regret amongst those who voted. There's perhaps some evidence of it amongst those who did not. But there's also the question of, forgive the term, but betrayal.
Rob.
I'm sorry. That was also the reaction my wife had.
I'm with her.
The segment of the public that was UKIP then Brexit, or Brexit then UKIP, has very, very high expectations about what change will happen when Brexit comes. And at some point, one has to expect those expectations to come down to earth. And remember, these are voters that have a long-standing distrust of the political system and of the people who run it. So at some point, one would expect them to have some sort of a hangover. And one has to then think, well, what effect will that have on politics when that hangover kicks in? And the final thing I think we may start to see, given how long this process is dragging on and how completely it's dominating our politics, is we may see Brexhaustion. Again, sorry. Voters are going to be sick to death of talking about Brexit. It's hard to get them very excited about customs unions and frictionless borders and trade deals and so on. At some point, they're going to want to talk about something else. So even if, broadly speaking, they'd rather go back to how things were, they may feel more strongly that rather than have another very extended argument about this, they just want to move on to something else. And as a result, the end of the transition period may come as something of a relief, and they'd all like to just move on to talking about politics domestically. And then you have to wonder, well, what happens then given all the problems that are accumulating in the background while we all focus on Brexit? And with that abuse of the English language, I will stop before I do any more harm.
Thank you, Brob. Lots of questions you've thrown up. We'll be, no doubt, talking about those later. Tim, over to you.
Okay. Well, actually, hopefully what I'm going to say follows on quite neatly from what Rob said. I don't know if any of you, like me, wake up to the Today programme in the morning, but you may have heard on that, and you may have read in your newspapers maybe, particularly if you read the Times or indeed the Sun, that there was a story surrounding the fact that the UK seems to have lost 600,000 migrants into this country, or at least lost track of those migrants. Now, this is a story that, had it happened under a Labour government, I think would have had legs, would have lasted days, weeks probably, resulted in the resignation possibly of a Home Office minister or even the Home Secretary. But I suspect that it will be a one-day wonder. And one of the reasons for that is not just because it's occurred under a Conservative government, but because I think Brexit has tended to sort of blot out a lot of other stories that otherwise would attract an awful lot of attention for a long time, even when those stories are actually quite relevant to Brexit. Because if you think that through, that indicates just how unprepared, arguably, we are for a new immigration regime whenever the government deigns to tell us exactly what that will be. Now, I bring that up, really, because I think it illustrates the fact that we have this kind of all-consuming, at the moment, attitude to Brexit. And as Rob said, I think we should be starting to think about what life is going to be like after it, if it occurs. Now, I know that talking about an all-consuming obsession with Brexit in front of an audience which has an all-consuming obsession with Brexit, otherwise you wouldn't be here, is a slightly odd thing to do. But I do that to raise a couple of questions, really. And these are the questions. Do we think that Brexit has suspended all the laws of politics? Okay. In other words, is politics now going to be completely different from what it was before? We've heard that, people have suggested that it's going to be about open versus closed, for example, old versus young, rather than state versus market, etc., etc. So that's maybe something that we could get into to the Q&A. But it's also, I think, to confess candidly that I don't know the answer to that. To quote a former Prime Minister, who I think you heard from a little earlier, that's the other TB. The other TB said, I think it was in 2001, if you remember, the kaleidoscope has been shaken, the pieces are in flux, and then I think the last bit, to get it right, was soon they will settle again. Well, I am not sure that it's actually possible to tell where they will settle, when they will settle, or even if they will settle. And anyone who says that they can is either a fool, or an academic, or a politician, or even a journalist. But it's fun to guess, right? So we'll have a guess at some of those questions. In the short term, what's worth guessing about? Well, clearly, one thing that's worth guessing about is how meaningful will this meaningful vote at the end of the year actually be? Will it be offering MPs the choice between leaving on the terms that the Prime Minister has negotiated, or just crashing out of the EU? Will it be about leaving on the terms negotiated or not leaving at all? We still don't actually know that. Second question that's worth guessing is, will the Tory Remainers have the courage of their convictions? Will they eventually put their votes in Parliament where their mouths have been, sometimes very loudly in some cases, for a few months now? And then, of course, the big one in some ways, because if this question isn't answered, the other questions don't really matter. Will Labour vote for that deal, or will they at least not vote against that deal? Now, for me, partly because I am interested in the way that power is distributed within political parties, and indeed I'm obsessed with party members, that last question is the most interesting one. If Labour does vote for the deal, or at least doesn't vote against the deal, then for me and for other academics, that will prove that Bob Mackenzie, who was the equivalent in his day of Sir John Curtis, that will prove that Bob Mackenzie was right. In other words, for all Labour's talk about internal party democracy, in the end, actually, Labour is no different from the Conservative Party in being completely driven by the leadership and the group around the leadership. I suspect also that if Labour does, as Emily Thornberry has sort of let the cat out of the bag, vote for the government's deal, then it will prove the critics of Jeremy Corbyn right. Either Jeremy Corbyn is indeed and still is a Eurosceptic left-winger, and or he is as spineless and scared of voters as all the other Labour leaders who have preceded him. So those are the short-term questions. The long-term question, which is interesting, I think, is whether Labour's complicity, if it is complicity in the kind of Brexit that Theresa May seems to be planning, will it help them or will it harm them in the long term? I suspect that the latter is more likely. In other words, it will harm Labour. If Brexit is a success, then I don't think the fact that Labour went along with it will actually mean that it gets the credit for it. I think that will go to the Conservative government. If Brexit is a failure, then Labour will be denied the chance to say, I told you so. Having said that, I think that in politics, as in domestic life, I told you so isn't always a particularly winning argument in any case. Now, if Labour does go along with Theresa May, we do go out on the terms that she's negotiated. One thing I think in the long term will be true is that we won't really ever be able to compare what we have with what we were missing, right? It's a bit like, you know, when you have kids, okay? It's best to just get on with raising those kids rather than indulging in the fantasy of, oh, I wonder what would happen to my life if I hadn't had those children, okay? It will just be like that. It will be impossible to tell, and we will just have to get on with it. And as Rob says, what will then happen, maybe we go back to, you know, beginning to think about state market, the state of the NHS, you know, immigration, etc., education, all these things that normally preoccupy us. Just to finish by flogging that metaphor a little bit more, that sort of family metaphor. Who's had kids in this room? Who's had children in this room? Right. Who did antenatal classes? Right. If you go to antenatal classes, you will find that you spend all the time, well, 99% of the time in antenatal classes, thinking about the preparations for the birth, pregnancy, and the birth itself. Once that occasion actually happens, once the birth is over with, you realise that you wasted most of that time, and in fact, you wish you'd spent more time thinking about the challenges that you face for the next few years, rather than for the few months and the few hours that the other event actually took up. And I suspect that Brexit will be very like that.
That's very good. Very good.
Very good. Tim, you've moved that piece of paper, but this is why he doesn't do slides. I don't know if you can see that. That is when you have a professor with a brain the size of a car park. That's how
Can I have that?
Ali.
So I'm at a slight disadvantage in that being on a panel with two academics who get to kind of observe, analyse, guide, but here I am, a market participant in the act of politics. But I just thought I'd try and share with you some of my thoughts as to where the political questions are. I'm, you know, for the record, still in favour of Britain's membership of the European Union. So, I mean, I'm going to try and be as fair as I can, but I obviously comment it from that direction, and I'm the co-chair of the Labour campaign for the single market. So, I mean, I'll be absolutely fair to my front bench as well, of course. But I just wanted to talk about what I see as a kind of new division on the Brexit question, especially, I think, amongst political colleagues, which is those for whom Brexit is a matter of certainty versus those of whom all they see is Brexit uncertainty. From a point of view of those who, there's people who think it's absolutely certain to happen and, you know, nothing will get in its way, through to those who see both the uncertainty that Brexit is causing for our economy and also, and therefore, a level of uncertainty about Brexit itself. And this really starts, I guess, from the general election, because I think what Theresa May, what I think she was trying to achieve by calling that general election was certainty. She needed to command the view of the British public in the negotiations. So from a sort of outsider's point of view, I don't blame her at all for calling the general election. Strategically, you can see why she did it. She wanted to have a stonking great majority in the House of Commons. She could whip through anything she needed to, move very quickly and have a strong position as she negotiates with the European Union. Unfortunately for her, it kind of didn't work out like that. And so hence, after the general election, we heard that kind of like nothing has changed mantra, nothing has changed. We're still going to Brexit, absolutely nothing has changed. But actually it changed quite fundamentally because it undermined the central argument of those for whom the referendum was a done deal. I hear the rhetoric all the time, and it's part of the betrayal, do we say, Rob? The betrayal,
Sorry.
it's all right. The betrayal narrative is to say that somehow the referendum vote on that one day absolutely determined the future of our country, that those who'd campaigned for leave could describe in great detail minute matters of public policy for years to come because they'd earned the right, because they'd gained the support of 52% of those who voted in the referendum. Unfortunately, the general election undermined that somewhat because we now have a hung parliament. And as Andrew Mitchell, the Conservative ex-Secretary of State for International Development said shortly after we returned after the election, in a hung parliament, power passes, Andrew said, from the cabinet table to the chamber of the House of Commons. And that's why I think more people in politics feel a sense of Brexit uncertainty, because the fact is, the kind of mantra of the Leavers, I think, is coming apart at the seams. Theresa May and her colleagues often describe the take back control idea as being about taking back control of our money, our laws, and our borders. And there's been great debate in recent weeks over especially the money question in terms of money for the NHS, and I think that's why Theresa May is going to try and firm up their commitments on money for the health service, to try and somehow make good to that promise. But we're yet to see anything like the level of Brexit dividend that people may say we haven't left yet. But actually, most of the economic indicators are pretty bad, which is what I'll come to. Secondly, on our laws, as the offer of new trade deals are sort of held out by Liam Fox and others, I think it's becoming pretty clear to a lot of us what a trade deal is. And that's basically a way in which you do a deal with another country to pool some of your sovereignty and agree ahead of time that whatever rules that you agree to, whatever laws of that trade deal you agree to, will be decided by an independent arbiter. Something like, not the extensive way in which the single market operates, but it's basically a very similar principle. And this is behind the entire argument about the ECJ and the transition, that this idea of sovereignty that was sold to people in the Brexit referendum is not so meaningful when you're talking about pooling your sovereignty in order to do a trade deal. And finally, on our borders, as has already been said, we don't really know what our new immigration policy is going to be. I sit on Treasury Select Committee with several people who are supporters of Brexit, and we've been wrestling with this very question in recent sessions, because what our immigration policy is will have a profound impact on the possibility of growth in our economy and also how we can deliver public services. So we are in a world of Brexit uncertainty, and I think there are those in politics who are desperate to cling on to Brexit as a certainty, but all the while the practicalities make us very uncertain. Meanwhile, those of us who think that at the very least we have to have a kind of least worst Brexit of staying in the single market hold that view essentially because of what's happened since the referendum. Growth is poor. I mean, we're not predicting a recession, but Brexit hasn't happened yet. But we're now the worst performing economy on growth in the G7. We were one of the best before the referendum. I could talk at length about the jobs market and what's happened and why we've got low unemployment and productivity is through the floor, and we've got hyper flexibility and 0 hours contracts, which means that people essentially aren't doing that much better even if they're in employment. But more worrying for me are the signs and signals coming out of British industry, whether it's Unilever going to the Netherlands, Maplin's shutting down because of currency risk, or in my own backyard, Vauxhall Motors having shed lots of jobs already. I think that the story coming out of industry is not a good one. And that finally leads me to Northern Ireland, where, you know, I think for a lot of us in progressive politics, the Good Friday Agreement is pretty much the biggest red line that there is. You know, it was an incredible job to bring about that agreement that's meant peace for Northern Ireland for a whole generation. And the Tories simply have no way in government of protecting the Good Friday Agreement on their current ideas of what Brexit can be. But I just want to finish after that kind of description of the uncertainty and negativity we face around Brexit, just to finish really where Tim did, which is the biggest problem for me with Brexit is the problems that it will cause in and of itself. Actually, the bigger problem is the opportunity cost of all the things we're not doing. Because in the end, I think the group of politicians that will win this argument, that will in the end win over the British public, that group will have to have a hopeful vision of our country. They'll have to have ideas about what Britain can be in the future. That means a much more positive offer. As it happens, I think for those areas where they've seen little economic progression and there was a leave vote somewhat as a protest vote, as it happens, I think that we have all the powers we need to turn that around within the European Union. But we won't earn the right to do it for the British public unless we have a hopeful economic vision that we can give them.
Thank you very much indeed. I should say you're going to hear from someone with a different perspective on things in due course, because you may have noticed we're not an entirely politically balanced panel here, but don't worry, wait and you'll be rewarded. Can I just ask Rob, each of you a quick question, but Rob, from one of your graphs, if you look at the changes in opinion that have happened post the referendum, Remain seems to hit its potential sort of best moment about a year after the referendum happened or something, in terms of positive views of immigration, things like that. Is that because all people wanted was a sense of control and they now think they're moving towards that? Or is it the argument that many people made, I believe Linton Crosby amongst them, that David Cameron should have played it a lot longer and another year of debating it might have made a difference?
Well, there's a little bit of truth to the second one, which I'll come on to in a second. The reasons why that's happened are too big to be down to demographics. It's not just that a bunch of extra liberal graduates have showed up in the survey data and bumped things up. In fact, it occurs across all social groups, and we see it amongst Leavers as well as amongst Remainers. And I'm not entirely sure why that is. I mean, one big possibility is the symbolic possibility that the vote for Brexit has symbolised for people that a change is going to come on immigration. So even though no meaningful change has actually happened on immigration policy yet, they are confident that that is a mandate on which delivery will come, and that is enough for them. Another possibility is, which Tim alluded to, is that we're simply not talking about dysfunction in the immigration system anywhere near as much as we have done for most of the past 15 years, because there's no space left on the front page or the comment page, because all of the space is allocated to talking about the dysfunctions of the Brexit process. And maybe in that situation, which is the third point, people start to take a step back and they start to hear arguments. We've seen some people who've made these kind of arguments earlier today, from people like the CBI, from people like my employers in the university sector, from people across the political system saying, well, in the NHS or in the farms, these migrants are really important, and how are we going to replace them? And so they're hearing those arguments rather more than they were before, and they're hearing the migration system is broken and dysfunctional type arguments rather less. And I wonder if that's what's driving it, but I'm not entirely sure. But longer run, Linton Crosby is probably right, because the pro-migration segments of the electorate are growing, but it's quite a slow process.
Annie, you were making some of the arguments still for staying in as well, the benefits of staying in. What percentage chance do you give us of remaining in? And how do you get from A to B?
Are you looking for a bookmaker? I mean, I'm not in the crystal ball business on that. I am accused of making the same arguments as were made in the referendum, often, to which I would say, well, the fundamentals of how our economy hasn't changed. So there's not much I can do about it. Like, we still have an integrated manufacturing system that produces cars across borders, you know, with complicated supply chains. And those, you know, that the impact of Brexit will be the same. So,
But I have a suspicion you wouldn't be doing it unless you thought there was a chance. How could we get there? Could you sort of game us through how we might stay in?
well, I think our EU membership has to stay on the table. And one of the reasons why I think that is because it's Labour Party policy. In 2016, after the referendum, my party voted at its conference to keep our EU membership on the table, to, you know, only support Brexit that didn't harm job prospects, and that's, you know, has informed Keir Starmer's tests for the deal. If Theresa May kind of hadn't called that general election, maybe we would have been in a slightly more certain position. I don't know, but the fact that she did means that we have got a democratic deficit here. You know, no one party won the general election, so nobody's really got the right to say this, our manifesto, is what people voted for. And what I'm trying to articulate is the best possible chance for people in Britain, I mean, my constituents in particular, but people in Britain, to have a decent income and a decent job. And I still think that the arguments stack up in favour of being in the EU. If in the end, you know, we don't get there and we do Brexit, then I will argue for us to have the least worst version of it for jobs and incomes in our country. But I think, you know, if you get to a point where it's clear that there isn't overwhelming support for what is on offer, then I think we've got to think about a way, whether that's kind of final say vote or whether that's, you know, a general election. We've got to find out a way to give democratic legitimacy to what we're doing.
What percentage would you put on staying in?
Surely you have got a crystal ball, Tim.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess I'm like a lot of people. I mean, you know, it goes up and down, to be honest. I mean, you know, when I hear some Conservatives MPs talk about how firmly they believe either in a kind of softer Brexit than the one that seems to be on offer, or indeed sometimes even staying in the EU, I believe that they may vote in such a way as to make that more likely. On the other hand, when I look at how they actually behave, it strikes me that when it comes to the crunch, far fewer than 15 of them are going to vote that way. And I'm not entirely sure, as I said before, what Labour is going to do. And I think that's the place we need to be looking at. But we also need, coming back to something that Rob says, we need to be looking at public opinion as well. Unless public opinion shifts markedly, I don't think either those Conservative MPs or indeed probably the Labour front bench, or at least the parts of the Labour front bench that seem to count nowadays, are actually going to shift their position. And the only way I think the public opinion is going to shift is if there is some sort of huge looming economic disaster. And I just can't see that happening over this summer. Now, as I can't see that happening over this summer, I can't see public opinion shifting that much. And because I can't see public opinion shifting that much, I can't see the MPs voting to actually stop Brexit. So I would say right now, cards on the table, I think it's sort of, you know, 90% likely that we'll leave, right?
Interesting that that's the same number I get from quite a few people who are part of pro-Remain campaigns.
Yeah, yeah.
The one sort of interesting angle on that, on the public opinion point, is, I guess, why in the general election, you know, everybody thought that kind of Labour MPs representing leave areas would do incredibly badly, and actually many of them didn't. Even people who were fairly, you know, even those who voted against Article 50, for example. And I think that perhaps the kind of, there's one overall picture of public opinion, but underneath that, there's what Labour Leave voters are doing versus what Tory Remain voters are doing. I think it might be slightly more complicated.
That's true, but I mean, I think for Conservative MPs, particularly Remain MPs, I mean, if they want to remain as MPs, they're going to have to think about their, local constituency associations. And to be honest, I suspect that voting or being seen to vote to block Brexit will be, signing their own death warrants as far as, their kind of selection as parliamentary candidates for the Conservative Party is. For Labour, not the case.
Is that really interesting because no one ever asked that question of John Redwood? John Redwood represents a Remain constituency. And yet he's been absolutely vehement. And nobody ever asks him this question, like, don't you think you ought to stand up for your constituents, otherwise you might lose? But funnily enough, and probably sadly, it's not actually their voters they're concerned about, it's their party members they're concerned about. It's the local Conservative Association. The logic of that then the logic of that on the Labour side then is that if Labour MPs are concerned about their local Labour parties, then
they're pretty Remainy.
They're very Remainy.
But a lot of your fellow Labour MPs, some of them who've been ardent Remainers all their lives, will no longer make those arguments because they think they've made this judgment about their own constituents, and they know they don't want. They've got constituencies that are 70-30 plus in favour of Brexit.
There's a sort of maths thing here, though, which is that it's not. People can have a constituency that might vote 60 or 70% to leave, but actually that might not be the people who are voting for that Member of Parliament. And this is why that was exactly the point I was making about the last general election. I think actually, though, the bigger thing is, to be quite honest, it's not really what our constituents want to talk to us about. So I think people in this room might be quite surprised how few of my constituents raise Brexit with me. A lot of them come to see me about the fact that, the ambulance service in our area is not very good.
They might. Some of them raise it if it was stopped.
Maybe.
I mean, what kind of backlash there would be if it didn't happen? Now we're running up close to your coffee break, so I should take some questions. Gentleman over there had his hand up. Yeah.
Just one point to Professor Tim Bale. Emily Thorne with Keir Starmer and Hilary Benn, they've had an input into the Brexit process, so obviously they're going to be for it. And Ali, I'd just like to ask you this. Labour voters voted to remain. Young people voted to remain, and Labour young people voted to remain. So why is it that the only thing that these Remainers in your party have picked up is European-style anti-Semitism? So why is it your party members, young activists, are so anti-Semitic?
Well, we might skip that
this
for now.
is a Brexit
there will be many
phenomenon.
opportunities, I'm sure, to get... Gentleman with the white hair just there.
To borrow from Rob, UKIP's had its Brexistential moment.
Round of applause.
What have I done?
And the demographic picture we see suggests that the Tories might have a Brexistential moment, and Labour might get classified, as someone said, as supporting the Tories and may also experience a Brexistential moment. Who's going to come first of those two?
Or is this a Macron-style question? I don't know. Rob,
Well,
easy one.
Who's going to come first? What, in terms of Brexistential moments?
Who's going to cease to exist first?
Well, I'd say, if I was a betting man, I'd say...
You are a betting man, Rob.
Not always successfully so. I would, well, on the odds, I'd say UKIP looks in the most trouble. But on that point, I think it's important to remember that if UKIP were to cease to be as a party, which looks considerably more possible than it did a couple of years ago, the lack of an outlet for that politics doesn't mean it will go away. And indeed, in a sense, in this country, we declared victory too soon once before, when the BNP collapsed, and we thought, oh well, that's it for that kind of radical right, far right politics. And then UKIP took up many of those themes and surged in the polls. There's still going to be 15 to 20% of the electorate who feel in a UKIP-y way about many issues, and it's likely that they'll have other reasons for being angry and disappointed in coming years, economic reasons, political reasons. So if my bet on UKIP disappearing were to come off, unlike many of my recent bets, that wouldn't mean that there wouldn't be something UKIP-y on the horizon a few years down the line. So we definitely shouldn't declare victory on that issue of the radical right in British politics and move on necessarily. Indeed, given that these are voters who have in the past felt ignored and left out of the political conversation, if everyone were to declare victory and move on and stop talking to them, that would indeed increase the likelihood that something else appears to fill that gap.
But I wonder if there's tensions for other parties that tensions in both parties are fairly clear, but they could be really quite serious later, say after the moment of Brexit. I've heard Labour MPs say, well, we're staying together for the kids at the moment, and then after Brexit, things might change. And I've heard Tory MPs say, we might put up Brexiteers, say we might put up with all sorts of what Emily Thornberry was calling blah, blah divorce, sort of vapid, jelly-like settlement. But the moment Brexit has happened and we're into the transition and some detailed negotiating is going on, we're going to really use all our firepower, and that could get very ugly there. Are those scenarios things you can imagine?
Well, you can certainly imagine the Conservatives falling out over Europe. Yes, that's.
Could they wait until March next year, I suppose?
I think you're right in that. I mean, there does seem to be a kind of implicit agreement, I think, to keep their powder dry now and to wait. I think, particularly for Brexiteers, they seem to have swallowed a lot of compromises, really, because they've got their eyes on the prize, and that's leaving. I mean, as far as Labour is concerned, I mean, Ali can obviously say more.
She might not. We'll try.
About that than I would. I mean, it is interesting, as Ali says, that Labour members are very, very convinced Europhiles, to be honest. There's no other way of putting it. I guess the question is whether their love for Jeremy will trump their love for Europe. And I suspect, even with the row that we've just had over the last few days, that probably is the case.
Staying together for the kids?
Staying together because we're all Labour. I mean, you know...
After Brexit?
I got asked this. So just after this, and actually with the rise of Macron, I had to go on Newsnight with Ed Vaizey.
Don't use that word.
Yeah.
Sorry. But
other programmes are available.
Exactly. Well, and we had to sit there and, you know, talk about Macron. And the discussion was supposed to be, you know, you two, who are both kind of anti-Brexit and kind of seen as the so-called centre of politics, haven't you got more in common than you have with other members of your own party? Which is all very interesting as a kind of parlour game. But I walk through the division lobby every single night I'm in the House of Commons with Jeremy Corbyn. And the Tories all managed to get through the division lobby, you know, day in, day out together. So I think that there is a kind of, you know, there's an interesting analysis that says that somehow there's big divisions within the party. And of course, on Europe, you know, there is clearly people have taken slightly different positions. I think the idea that somehow the fundamental values are shifting is wrong because, you know, especially on domestic policy, I mean, you know, we are constantly campaigning on all the different issues, mainly because our constituents keep asking us to do so in quite a united way. And the thing that I would say is, to be honest, Keir set out the tests. The tests are pretty clear. It's all the stuff that I've talked about, jobs and growth and whether people will have decent rights at work. And if it doesn't meet those tests, we're not going to vote for it. Simple as that.
We are now at your coffee break. I have been appalling at letting you come in and ask questions. So I would ask you to please forgive me and thank our guests.